Hey everybody, thanks for checking out the channel. Subscribe to keep up with all the latest RC crawler science and sometimes tangent videos like this one. This series is called What's Up With My Rig Today. I'll share the current state of my crawler, which is always evolving, and show you some of the concepts I'm exploring. Hopefully that will give you some ideas for your beast, and I'd love to hear about your vehicle in the comments. I get a lot of questions about what exactly is this rig and what is my setup, and I don't think it's ever been the same vehicle in any two videos because it's constantly evolving, always changing, hopefully always making improvements, maybe going backwards sometimes, but it's always evolving. And I'm about to make a big change. I'm about to put on my own chassis just because I couldn't get the mounting points that I wanted out of a stock chassis, so I cut my own by hand. We'll give it a test and see how it goes. Right now, the heart of this chassis is a Poizd T3 chassis, and it's really one of the first ultra high clearance rear end rigs to come out, and I really fell in love with it. I also really like the look of the Capra body. So my Capra is narrowed by 18 millimeters. Everything's chopped skinnier. And I like the look of it better than the stock Capra, which just seems real wide to me. So I made all my own carbon fiber spacers and narrowed the chassis down. It was surprisingly easy to make it narrower, and I really like how it turned out. So I'm going to keep running this kind of body. It's not quite as light as a full Lexan body, but it's pretty light. Definitely lighter than a stock Capra. For axles, I have a Vanquish F9 Capra in the front, and it has a narrower stance than my rear axle. So in order to keep the same track width front and rear, I run low offset wheels in the front and high offset wheels in the back. And the reason is that in the front, I want the front wheels to really swing and have a lot of scrub. That way I can reach up with the wheel and grab up higher on some terrain. In the back, I want the opposite. I want my wheel to turn really tightly without swinging a big arc. Because normally when you're climbing up a hill like this, you don't want your wheel swinging. You just want a real tight turn like this rather than a big arc, because it kind of upsets the whole chassis on steep inclines. So in the back, I have the widest axle. It's an SD Deluxe, and the kingpins are wider on this than the front, so I run a higher offset rear hubs so that the track width is the same front and rear. I also put this brass roller on my steering axle back here. The idea is that when you're on rocks or something, it'll kind of roll. I don't know how well this works. I might take it off, but I like the idea of it. It's kind of a roller and it doesn't weigh very much. Now take off some wheels so you can get a better look. Don't lose your adapters. Now, if you've been following me, you know how much I hate link risers. And you might be saying, hey, you got a link riser. Well, there's a very special reason for that. I've got a different kind of setup here. My upper rear links are attached right here to where the shock is. So my body hinge and my shocks and my upper links all use the same mounting position and the same bolt in the rear. And I'll explain why. If you've got one of these high clearance chassis, which a lot of people run, what you want is your links and your drive shaft to all be hidden within the profile of your chassis. If your links are hanging down like this at full bottom out, then you're kind of defeating the purpose of having such a high clearance rear end. So I try to have all my stuff tucked in as high as possible, as low profile as possible within the profile of the chassis. That way you get the maximum clearance. Now, the one thing I don't like about these forward bias chassis, and what I mean by that is there's a new wave of chassis. A lot of people are doing them. Poizd was the first to make it real popular, but you've got a really heavily front biased motor and transmission. So your skid is moved really far forward. And that's great because it naturally puts heavy components farther forward, which means you need less brass to artificially weight your front end down. One of your very best tricks is moving components that have to be on the vehicle as far forward as possible, because that's free forward weight bias. So as this front skid got further and further forward, the rear links got longer and longer and longer. Many links are 8 and 9 inches long, and that started to be ridiculous to me. So what I've done is I've got my lower links mounted where the upper links go, and I've got my upper links mounted on a lift and then mounted here. So I basically shifted my links up. They still perform exactly the same as they did, they've just been shifted upwards. Now, I'm sure a lot of people will ask about anti-squat and other things, and I'll maybe get into that in a different video. What's important maybe to realize here is that I had to use this link riser in this configuration in order to keep, let's see if I can get it in the video, in order to keep the pinion angle level. You can see the pinion isn't swinging a weird arc. If this were down here, then the rear axle and the drive shaft and the pinion was swinging, and I didn't want it to swing. I wanted it to stay in line with the front of the drive shaft. So by laying the geometry out like this, it was necessary to move this point up to match the rest of it. So I wouldn't call this a link riser in the traditional sense. It's a link riser in my sense. I like to use Lexan body panels because they're about half the weight of carbon fiber panels, and they don't get scratched up. At least the paint doesn't get scratched up. This one's pretty abused from being upside down a lot. I used a Tamiya clear tint Lexan paint to get the orange on. Then I sprayed some glitter metal flake paint, and then I painted gray behind that to kind of back it up. That's how I got this look. I used titanium bolts on the body panels because they're half the weight of steel, plenty strong, and trying to reduce any gram you can high on the chassis is very valuable. On the front here, I made my own low profile mini bumper. You can see I chopped the whole Capra light bar that's normally here off, and I replaced it with this single carbon fiber bumper. It's the same diameter as the rest of the tubes, so visually it kind of looks appropriate, and it uses the same 2 screws that held the light bar on the front. So I'm pretty happy with how this bumper turned out. And then of course I had to shorten the hood, and the sides are cut narrower as well. I got a driver in here. I painted his helmet to match. I just think a car needs a driver. It makes it look more realistic for a car that already doesn't look realistic. I'm gonna take these other wheels off. Don't lose your spacers. There we go. Now you might be wondering why you don't see any springs. Well, right now I'm not running any springs front or rear, and I will make a video to explain that theory. If you're running coil springs and hair bands or pen springs together, they're kind of just canceling each other out, which is the same as not having any spring. So for the moment, I have no springs, but I am going to change that. In the rear, I run stock Capra plastic housings because they're really strong. But I use an aluminum outer plate to kind of reinforce it even further. And this has been a great setup. It's really lightweight and quite durable. In the front, I've got full brass. These are the deluxe super heavy brass. I'm about to change this to a different weight configuration, which I'll show you in another video. Another thing I do is I have my steering servo stacked above the tie rods. That's because you have a real tall bolt, and this bolt has a tendency to bend, which is great in a crash. So it's kind of a crude servo saver where you've got this cantilever bolt up here, and I can show you I've got plenty of bent bolts. This bolt's definitely bent, and it's kind of a poor man's servo saver, but it works great. I'm going to take the body off. I hold the front of the body down with these rubber bands, hair bands, and these hair bands also double as my shock compression bands. And another nice thing about that is when you crash into something, your body has some give and it can move. It's a lot less rigid, and it kind of protects your body. So 2 birds, 1 scone. Again, this is a hairband, and that's what holds my front end down and also keeps the shocks compressed in the front. So I'm going to take off the body now. There's nothing attaching the body in the front. It's all back here on this hinge. And like I said, 1 long bolt holds everything together in the back. It's really clean, simple, lightweight, compact. I'm gonna keep this together for just a minute. Okay. Oops, got a zip tie. So here's my body. Like I said, these are carbon fiber tubes that I made myself, and at every point, basically, you can hold the 2 plastic stock halves together with a different width spacer at every location, and it's turned out pretty good. I've got this guy on a little carbon plate, just add some character. Let's weigh this and see what this body weighs. So this body looks like it's 140 grams. Like I said, you can definitely be lighter with the Lexan body, but again, I like the look, and for 140 grams, I can live with it. Now we've got the top off. Another thing I did is I have the chassis rails down to 56 millimeters. I started at 65, 60, 56, and my next one's going to be 55. That's as narrow as I can get the transmission to fit between them. And the narrower and narrower that I went, I realized I could do a few other things. I now have my links on the outside of the chassis rails, and my shocks, as you noticed before, were on the outside of the body because the body is pinched in. I also built this carbon lead-in ramp for the servo. This is basically a quarter round of carbon with an L of carbon glued into it. Then it's taped onto the servo. And what that does is it's just a lead-in ramp, so rocks can slide over this and not get hung up on the servo. And then I have this protection plate. I'll probably make a wider one because this one is from an older setup, but this is just kind of a skid plate that protects the servo, and I'm going to run it out here a little bit wider on both sides, and that just gives you a smooth skid surface to get the rear axle over stuff. I also do the same in the front. I've got this skid plate taped to the bottom of the servo, and that's kind of a lead-in ramp to my custom skid here. Again, this keeps rocks and sticks and stuff from getting stuck in all these crevices, and just rolls nicely up onto your skid. I also use some clear skid tape, but it's not very durable and doesn't stick that great, so this is really just to kind of hide the leading edge of the skid plate, but it doesn't really work that great. I'm going to look for something better. All right, so one more look at the rear suspension here. I've got these real short upper links. And if you use a link riser to keep them level, if you do that, your pinion angle will remain very constant. So I wasn't able to get the performance I wanted from this lower point. So this upper point is the key to making these short upper links work. And again, my lower links are mounted not at the skid, they're mounted up here where the upper links used to be. So basically my lower link is higher and my upper link is higher. I designed my own mid-bearing carrier, 3D printed in plastic, bearings pressed in, and it bolts to this upper plate. Now when I had my links on the inside of the chassis, these links could fold up into this space, left and right. That's why I designed it this way. This plate is as high as possible, allowing your links to tuck in. But as I got narrower and narrower, I didn't need to tuck my links in between here anymore. And of course, the original design had 2 links on the inside. The upper links and lower links all ran from here and here, had to fold up into here. And it's just a real ugly mess having all your links crammed in this area. So I feel like this link layout is really working great, but to make it work, you have to have a narrow rail width and you have to be able to have some flexibility with your rear link placement. Right now my receiver's just rattling around. With my new chassis, I'll have a mount for it. I've got a Holmes 540M 18 kV motor. I normally like bigger motors because they have longer runtime, but as the skid moved more and more forward, I had to go with a shorter and shorter motor. So this is where I'm at. Don't love the runtime. I used to have a Castle Slate, and that thing would probably run 3 times the runtime as these tiny outrunners. So now I just carry a pocket full of batteries. This is a custom skid that you may have seen in my other video. I've got it scooped out in the center for maximum clearance. I've got a big lead-in ramp on the front. And the chassis I'm cutting for myself is going to be at 25 degree skid. The stock Poizd is 13 degrees. So to test it, I just had a little spacer. So my skid is actually at 25 degrees to test all the other components, how they work. And now I'm going to get rid of this and design the chassis specifically for that angle. It's going to be a lot cleaner than this. Also, I started making my front end shorter and shorter. I started with 75 millimeter long lower links, and I kept going shorter and shorter and shorter, moving my skid more and more forward, getting a shorter motor, designing a custom servo mount so that I could cram everything closer. And now I'm down to 65 millimeters on my front links. That's really short. The problem is there were no more shock mounting locations. So I have this temporary aluminum plate in here to make my shock mounts. So this is why I had to cut my own chassis, because there aren't the right points any longer in this. And if you take a look, you can see my chassis is going to be from this point to the skid points, actually really quite small. And I'm stoked to try this out. And I've got a new skid for it that I printed. And one feature that I made is the skid overlaps the chassis to protect the carbon. So it kind of fits in this little pocket. Hopefully you can see that. We'll see how it works. Again, because the chassis is so narrow, 55 millimeters, you don't have to put your links on the skid or in the middle of the skid any longer. You can place them on the outside. So I built this battery mount. It's attached to the axle. It's from an L-shaped piece of carbon. The battery sits right here. And I don't know if I love it. I always put a second layer of shrink wrap around my batteries to protect them better. And I don't like the logos and all the colors of the battery. So this just blacks out the battery, adds a little more protection. It's not as ugly as a lot of batteries floating on the front axle that I've seen out there, but I still don't totally love it. I think it could be lower somehow, and I may revisit that. But for now, this is where the battery goes. Another thing that you'll probably be interested in is my servo mount. I've been running this servo mount for quite a while. It's custom made. Basically, there's a little carbon plate, and there's three plastic printed parts, real small. This only fits a Vanquish F9 axle, but my thinking is this. This is as far forward as possible. It's also as low as possible. It's actually, the bottom of the servo is flush with this plate on the bottom of the axle. So I was able to move my weight forward and down as much as possible. Now you might say, well, this horizontal servo is actually lower, and that's true, but with the horizontal servo, you have to move your motor further back. So this I thought was a better compromise, having my skid and my motor really far forward by putting the servo at an angle really far forward. Then my speed controller is taped to the back of the servo. So talk about weight on axle. I have SOA, BOA, and ESCOA. Pretty much everything's on the front axle. The ESC, the servo, and the battery. Again, from this side you can see these are the skid bolts. This is my temporary adapter for the shock placement, and my rear links are completely tucked up within the profile of the chassis, and I'm using the upper chassis mounting locations for the lower links and the shock mount location for the rear upper links. I would highly encourage you guys to try this link layout. It solves a lot of problems. Another thing is that I have my transmission twisted. That's to try to get as nice and smooth of an angle as possible for the drive shafts. They run so much quieter when they're at a real nice straight angle. And same thing from the side. Same thing from the side. I have the drive shaft coming off the transmission, a really smooth angle, and then angling down really nice. It's really quiet and really smooth this way. I run direct power servos front and rear. I do that because I hate trying to find a place for the Castle BEC. That thing is almost as big as my speed controller. It's a bunch of extra wires, and yeah, I finally upgraded to direct power front and rear, really just to get rid of the BEC. I put this cable housing protection over all my servo wires to protect it because that wire moves. I don't protect my other wires necessarily because these don't move, they're just static. I only protect the ones that move with the suspension. So there you have it. There's some interesting things about my vehicle, and hopefully it'll give you some inspiration to improve yours.